and improve themselves. David was working as a prosecuting attorney and wanted to control his emotions because he would get so emotional during his closing arguments. And that was basically his entrance into Toastmasters. But you're going to hear once again about a seed that was planted when he was a very young man on the importance of Toastmasters and who put that seed there. And that was really the genesis of his Toastmasters journey. I think it's fascinating to see how we don't think we affect anybody, but what we say and do can affect people's decisions years later in their life. David has had a phenomenal run, phenomenal experience. He's going to share with you how hard he working the Toastmasters program to develop his speaking skills, the different regimens he put himself through, and the focus and intensity that he really, really worked this program to earn the spot of the World Championship of Public Speaking. Let's watch his speech and then listen to his interview.
Speaker number 5, David Henderson, The Aviators. The Aviators, David Henderson.
In 1983, the two best pilots in Texas teamed up to fight the Red Baron. We called ourselves the Aviators. Snoopy 1 to Snoopy 2. I see him. Brake hard right. Tighten your britches. I'm coming in hot. Mr. Contest Chair, fellow Toastmasters, it was official. We flew a bajillion combat missions with 0 casualties. We were invincible. So we thought. Truth is, we were too young to know that sooner or later, we all fall down. That's the bad news. The good news is, no matter how badly you fall, love can lift you back up. I met my first love in kindergarten. Every kid had a job during recess. We were cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, Barbies, and Kens. No two kids had the same job, which was most apparent the one day each year we wore our professional attire to school. Halloween. I had the costume contest in the bag until Jackie Parker walked in a Snoopy aviation costume just like mine. Except she had moves like a runway model. Ba-dum-bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. I thought I heard music, but it was just the rhythm of my heart. I looked at her and my eyes popped out of my head. And she looked at me the way my mom looked at my dad after he forgot their anniversary. Fellow Toastmasters, not only was I dressed like Snoopy, I was in the doghouse. Jackie walked up to me and said, "Oh, no, you didn't. Are you mad that we have on the same outfit?" "No." "Yes." "Maybe." I learned something that day. Girls don't mind when you show up wearing the same outfit. They mind when you show up looking better in the same outfit. You see, in addition to my helmet, goggles, and bomber jacket, I had a real silk scarf, and Jackie didn't. For some reason I didn't know then, and I don't know now. I gave my scarf to Jackie. She won the contest, but I won her over. After that, we were the Aviators. And we were invincible. But sooner or later, we all fall down. And Jackie fell and hurt her elbow. It seemed like no big deal at first. She took too long getting back up. No big deal. Her arm took too long to heal. No big deal. Until the doctor said she had a bone infection. That was a big deal. The reason why was even bigger. Jackie had sickle cell anemia, which meant our flying days were over. Now, many of you are wondering the same thing I wondered. What's sickle cell? It's a genetic blood disorder. People think of it as an African American disease, but it affects people all over the world, from the Middle East to Asia to South America. People with sickle cell have deformed red blood cells, which carry oxygen through your blood vessels. Normal cells look like discs and pass freely through your blood vessels. Sickle cells look like sickles. They clump together, causing traffic jams, which in turn cause episodes. First you're fine, and then you get an infection. And then you're fine, and then you're in pain. And then you're fine, and then you die. There is no known cure. I'm ashamed to say it now, but when my mom told me that, I questioned, what's the point in loving somebody? I mean, truly loving somebody, when you know they're gonna die. And fellow Toastmasters, I will never forget my mom putting her hands on my shoulders, looking me in the eyes and saying, baby, losing people is part of loving people. When it happens isn't up to you. All you get to choose is what you do with the time you have. Now that little girl needs you by her side, and hard as it is going to be, you need to be there or you will regret it for the rest of your life. And trust me, regretting is a lot harder than loving. So you be strong and you make me proud. They diagnosed Jackie when she was 7. And she died when she was 14 years old. And through those years, I found the strength to follow my mom's advice through every episode. I stuck by Jackie's side. And in the end, I decided to say goodbye the same way we said hello. I dusted off my helmet and I wore it to the hospital. You should have seen the look on Jackie's face when I asked her, do you remember how we first met? And she said, no, yes, maybe. And what she did next made me regret ever wondering whether it's worth it loving somebody when you know they're gonna die. She reached in her nightstand and she pulled out that scarf. And I said, you kept that thing? And she said, not the thing, David, the memory. When my pain got to where I couldn't bear it, I went back to the moment you gave this to me, and it got me through. Your love, it got me through. I hope giving it back does the same thing for you. Sooner or later, we all fall down. I've fallen down many times since then, but remembering Jackie always lifts me back up. Fellow Toastmasters, losing people is part of loving people, but if you do it right, they'll never leave your side, even after they're gone. Mr. Contest Chair.
In the audience, I'm sure you remember it too.
Absolutely. It's a nerve-wracking experience. It's great afterwards, but it's a nerve-wracking experience.
Yeah, it is. It pushes us, at least it did me, it pushed me to levels I would have never gone to if I hadn't been in that contest.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Let's go back to before David Henderson was an unknown worldwide phenomena. Okay, where were you living?
Now.
where were you living? What were you doing before you got into Toastmasters?
I was living in San Antonio, Texas. I was working as a prosecutor at the San Antonio District Attorney's Office. And I came to be there because when I got out of law school, I didn't know any lawyers. And I thought that the law firm I was going to work at went to trial all the time, and I learned they never, ever went to trial, which most law firms don't. So I went to San Antonio, and I joined the DA's office to improve my trial skills, and I very quickly learned that if you want to be a trial lawyer, you have to be a great public speaker. And contrary to popular opinion, lawyers are not good public speakers.
Yes.
They do not teach us that in law school at all. So that was one of the main driving forces to me joining Toastmasters. There was something else that was going on that it actually took me years after the contest to figure out that there were competing interests that led me to actually join and get involved with the contests.
What was your entrance point? Did you seek out Toastmasters? Somebody invite you? You saw a flyer in the hallway? What was the connection to Toastmasters?
This is going to sound like a commercial, but believe it or not, years before, this was 20 years before I joined, my mom had a friend, we used to call her Miss Woody, and Miss Woody could speak incredibly well. And as a child, I remember asking her, where did you learn how to talk like that? And she told me, when you grow up, join this organization called Toastmasters, and when you do, make sure you do the contest, because a lot of people join and they don't do the contest. But if you really want to become a better speaker, that's how you do it. So I started struggling with my communication. I knew I had to become a better public speaker in general. I was also having a really difficult time controlling my emotions in court. It only happened during closing arguments. It was only on certain types of cases, those involving serious abuse of children primarily. And so I knew I had to find some way to become better at communicating. And I remembered what Miss Woody said. So I found a local Toastmasters club and I joined it.
Wow. What was your experience walking in there? I'm just curious. As a new person, and you're sitting, I would sit in the back of the room, you're nervous, they call you up for table topics, what happened?
They did call me up for table topics. And by the grace of God, I won the table topic. I had the best table topic speech. So I figured, okay, this must be a sign that I should work hard at this and find a way to improve. But it's an intimidating environment, I think, when you first go there, because Toastmasters, those of us who are involved in Toastmasters take certain skills for granted. But when you're a new person stepping into this environment, you're normally in a room with the highest percentage of great speakers that you've ever been exposed to before in your life. So it's an intimidating environment, but I also knew it was one where if I came and I worked hard based on what everybody else was telling me, I can improve my speaking skills. And I was excited about that.
Oh, cool. What was your, when I look at your progress through Toastmasters, you came in, I'm sure you're trying to figure out what the system is, and you got this thing called a competent communicator, and you have to learn to evaluate, and you got to be a timer. How quickly did you move through things? You seem like the type of person that would probably more aggressively attack that than some. I know people that take 3 or 4 years to do a CC. What was your path on your development?
Right. I appreciate the compliment. I am notoriously bad at keeping track of my speeches. I really am. I've delivered enough speeches to be a DTM, but I'm bad about keeping up with my workbooks. And so I think technically I'm still a competent communicator. I made it through my initial book very quickly, and I've done some other activities. I've mentored several people. I think I've mentored 2 clubs that got started at this point. But in terms of just keeping track with the manuals, I'm absolutely terrible at it.
Well, what I'm really looking at here, David, is you come into Toastmasters, and what year was this?
2007.
2007. So 2007, you win in 2010, which is 2 to 3 years later, depending on when you came in, right?
Right. I think it was about 2.5.
Okay. And so I'm looking at a guy comes into Toastmasters. Were you just, it doesn't sound like you just had a lot of raw natural talent, because you're talking closing arguments, you realized you had to improve yourself and stuff. So you had a path to that world championship. And I'm looking at, in that club environment, what did you find your path?
I see what you're saying.
Where you were learning, and what barriers were you up against that you were discovering in Toastmasters? Oh, I'm better at this now, or I really need to work on that.
Absolutely. Now, I understand your question. It's interesting looking back, because I think that I had some skill coming into Toastmasters simply because I've always liked public speaking. That's part of what made me want to be a trial lawyer in the first place. But as I reflect back, and I think this is important to keep in mind from the beginning, from the time I joined Toastmasters to the time I won the world championship, I think my speaking ability improved probably tenfold. Literally, I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Mm-hmm.
Since I won the world championship to today, I think I'm probably 3 times better than I was at that time. So my learning curve was almost 90 degrees.
Yeah.
When I joined Toastmasters, I had a great mentor, and he was part of the reason why I joined the club that I did. He told me that he had been a judge at the international contest previously, some years past. And he told me that his philosophy with communication was, if the speech is good enough, you'll win no matter what. And if you lose, you assume that it was because your speech just wasn't good enough. So I started off with that mindset, and I met my wife around the same time. If you ever meet her, she will tell you that our first date was a Toastmasters meeting. That is a lie. It is not true, so do not believe her. But early on, she did start coming to the Toastmasters meetings with me. And this is the first level of my growth, because first time she saw me give a speech, she told me, had you been one of my professors in college, you would have been my favorite professor. But I don't think that's a good thing when you're talking to everyday people. And she was right. So the first thing I had to learn how to do was stop talking like a lawyer, which any profession you tend to do that, and you don't know that you're doing it, but it interrupts your ability to communicate as effectively as possible. So I had to learn to stop talking like a lawyer. And then I think that from the time you decide that you really want to improve your communication wherever you're at, unless you're already a professional level speaker, from the time you decide I really want to get better, it takes 2 years to master the basics. So in terms of voice projection, knowing what to do with your hands, how to stand, how to tell a story, I think those things took me about 2 years to master. And then the rest of the time I spent figuring out what my individual speaking style was, which is primarily storytelling. But I'm telling you, I had my mentor to give me advice, and he'd tear my speeches apart, and I'd have to figure out what was wrong and fix them. He wouldn't give me specific advice on what to do. He'd just say, it's bad. You need to change this. And then my wife and I would spend hours over coffee at Starbucks just talking through what I did right, what I did wrong, and deconstructing the speeches till I finally got to be pretty good at speech construction and delivery.
You said something that I want to just really make note of for the listeners to this, that you said we came into Toastmasters and the growth you had between coming in and being a world champion was like 10 times the growth. And since you became the world champion, you've probably tripled your speaking ability. And I just want to make that point. Everybody I've talked to and people have talked to me and I had a friend actually travel with me on my going out to districts and doing corporate speaking. And he looked at me one day and he goes, do you realize how much better you've become since the world championship?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to let people know that there's people that think, oh, the world championship is the top of the mountain. And this has come up in some other interviews as well. But no, to me, now I'm on solid ground. Now I have a solid platform I can stand from. And your growth continues. Your growth
Absolutely. It absolutely does.
On that. So what I'm hearing, David, is that this wasn't something that you just sat down and said, I'm going to write a speech and give it. And if you got some feedback that their speech wasn't good, those people are crazy. If you lost a speech contest or something, it wasn't like, oh, the judges are biased.
Not at all.
And you're talking about you and your wife spending so much time looking at your speeches and trying to figure out how to put them together. And one of the things that I would, in all these interviews, and one of the things I went through personally was there was a point where you felt, I felt I was really good. The audience didn't. And you have a tendency to want to blame somebody else other than yourself. And there's something I call like the champion attitude. The champion attitude is, that it's up to me to make it. Everything's on my side of the equation to make it work. I'm not the effect of a judge. I'm not the effect of the audience. I'm not the effect of a bad stage or a bad microphone. All those things have to come. But that took me a lot longer than 2 years. So if you were able to do it in 2 years, my hat's off to you. So
I do want to say this, though. I worked incredibly hard in that time period. And the reason why is because I was driven largely by an insecurity, because I was insecure about not being able to control my emotions during closing arguments. Something very powerful was happening. It took me several years to figure out what was actually happening, because I started off joining Toastmasters and my goal was to learn to speak so well that no one would know I felt emotional inside. I wanted to be stoic when I spoke. That's what I wanted to do. And I failed miserably at achieving that. You saw my final speech, so you know. So I finally realized, you know what? I'm just going to embrace these emotions and see what happens. Something happened that was much bigger than what I thought would ever happen. But then beyond that, I realized that at my core, I'm not actually a communicator. I took the Strength 2.0 test. Have you taken that test?
I haven't taken it, no.
I took it, and no, it gives you what your strengths are out of a list of like 50 possible strengths. One of them is communicator. So you would think if you won a speech contest, communicator would be one of yours, right? It is not one of mine. And when I took that test, I realized my communication skills are derivative of other skills that I have. And it took me a while to get a really good handle on them. But yeah, when I was going to the speech contest, I had trials that I had to keep track of. We'd have death penalty trials, first-degree felonies. So there were several nights where I would have to get out of court and stay up all night to finish prepping my speech for the contest the next day. But I was driven to do it because I just wanted to get a handle on what was going on inside the courtroom.
Well, I can only say that I'm glad at that point in your life you weren't a defense attorney. I would be very concerned that my defense attorney was leaving me in court and going home and working on his Toastmasters.
Yeah, I know, right? Exactly.
And a death penalty case, okay? On that. What was your first entrance into the contest? And now you've already said you should have had this thing and the seed planted when you were a kid in the back of your mind, getting a Toastmasters and do contest.
Right.
For a lot of people, doing the contest is a huge step, or they just do it not planning on anything happening, and they wind up on this conveyor belt or escalator going, what's the area? What's the division? They keep winning. What was your first contest, and what was your motivation to actually step up and get in the contest?
My first contest was, I think I started attending in the fall of 2007. So my first contest was that following international contest season. I think that was the first one that I actually entered.
Okay.
And a buddy of mine had been killed not long before that. He was a West Point graduate. He'd served 2 tours, if I remember correctly. And a group of guys actually broke into his house. Fortunately, his wife and his 2 daughters weren't there. And they killed him and stole his truck. And a couple of them were actually soldiers on the base nearby where he was working, which is out of Fort Hood. And I wanted to give a speech to commemorate him. Jason was his name. And so I wrote a speech about his experience. Gosh, I don't even have a copy of that speech anymore. I wish I did because it's so different from what my delivery is like now. But I wanted to do a speech to honor him. I thought it'd be a good way to enter the speech contest. And I was intimidated, but I was also motivated because I felt like competition would be a good way for me to be driven to get better. It's kind of like if you sign up to run a 5K, you have to be in good enough shape to at least complete the 5K. I thought the speech contest would work much the same way.
And not be the last one crossing the finish line. You wanted to save some grace and at least not be last.
Exactly. Exactly.
Just as a note to our listeners, you just made an interesting origination, which you wish you had a copy of that speech. And I'm fortunate that my club videos speeches, and when I was competing so long that every year I was videoing speeches so that I could evaluate my own speeches. But I highly recommend any Toastmaster. First of all, I recommend you video your speeches, so you just period as a learning tool. But had you done that, and this is the thing, you're now a world champion. You could take us back and, to us being Toastmasters who are not world champions and say, here is my speech, my first contest.
Absolutely.
And here is where I am now, because a lot of people, it happens to me, they look at me and they just think, and I'm sure that happens to you, David, they look at you and they think you've always been that way. And
Absolutely.
You just wrote a speech and won that year. They don't realize the growth we had to get to where we are.
That's true.
So when you show people actual, speeches, and of course, Darren LaCroix has one of his first comedy stand-up, which he's shaking on stage and nervous and dropping his papers and everything. And it's great to have that record. So anyway, I don't want to spend more time on this, but those Toastmasters listening, look at videoing your speeches, getting copies of them. It's a great learning tool. It's a great learning device to figure out what you need to improve. And if you ever make it in anything, you can go back and show your progression. It's a great history to.
Absolutely. I like that point that you made a lot, because something I found is true once you develop some speaking skill and you talk to people. When I'm talking to Toastmasters, I feel that sometimes Toastmasters slip into the role of being an observer rather than a participant. I've spoken at several conventions, I'm sure you have also, and sometimes I'll notice that Toastmasters will be there, and by the questions they ask, I'll find myself thinking, okay, you let yourself slip into the role of being an observer. You're supposed to be a participant in this. And I do fundamentally believe every single person who joins Toastmasters, I think anyone who masters the basic skills in Toastmasters can compete at the district level wherever they are. I think that if you want to go beyond that, you have to really intensely want to improve your communication skills. But the core theme here is, I think the way communication works, it's not an Olympic sport. Everybody has a unique ability to communicate in a way that's specific to them. I think your goal in Toastmasters is to figure out what that is and how to make the most of it, because we're talking about speech contests. My favorite speech I delivered after I won the World Championship, it was when my wife and I were married. We wrote our own vows. That is my favorite speech to date. And when I was writing my vows, I found myself realizing I was able to do a much better job than I would have been able to do prior to the time that I joined Toastmasters. My second favorite speech, my father passed away 2 years ago, and I delivered his eulogy. And when I wrote his eulogy, I found myself thinking, I'm able to communicate how I feel in a way that I would not have been able to do prior to the time that I joined Toastmasters.
That's great examples. And again, I just want to pull out for those listening. You had said a couple of things. You spent 2 years getting your basics in, and then the rest of it was figuring out like your speaking style.
Right.
And I had a very similar journey, and I've had a number of people ask me, who were your like mentors? Who did you emulate? Who did you listen to? Like, to be like. And I said, I wasn't doing anybody. I was watching everybody.
Right.
But I wanted to learn to be me on stage. I wanted to be the same person on stage you'd meet in the hallway. I wanted to find my speaking style. I wasn't trying to be like, Stephen Covey or, Tony Robbins or somebody you'd see on stage and you emulate somebody else who's successful.
Absolutely.
I wanted to find myself. And that was one of the reasons, too. I think it took me as long as it did, because my journey was really a journey more of self-discovery than it was of speaking. It was like figuring out who this guy is, deep down inside.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is just and to the Toastmasters listening, winning speech contest is great, but the two things you talked about, weddings and funerals, and your own wedding. But I've had the honor of, which I am an ordained minister, but I don't promote that a lot. I've had the honor of marrying several couples. And at the same token, I've probably done 15 funerals. Wow. And the most challenging speeches I've ever done in my life have been eulogies, because you have to honor the person, but also allow the audience to release that person, release their memories, release their thoughts, let go. And Absolutely. It's a very challenging talk. So it's interesting that you too have those same experiences. So let's go back. So that first time when you were talking about your friend who was unfortunately killed, how far did you go in the contest? How well did that go for you?
That year, I made it to division, and I lost at division. My first year, I made it to division. I lost at division. The second year, I made it to district, and I lost at district. And then the third year, I made it all the way. I think I placed second at division my first year competing. The next time I did the international contest, I placed second at district. Then the third year, I went all the way. My wife and I have talked about those contests looking back, because you always think, wow, maybe if I'd done this a little bit differently, I could have made it. I definitely was not ready. I definitely was not developed as a speaker the first year or the second year. You know what? I doubted that I was the third year, and I came this close to not enter the contest at all that year.
Wow. Not even entering.
Linda Williams, who has been very active in Toastmasters leadership, called me, I think it was a week or two before my club contest. And I guess it was just in her heart to give me a push, to just wish me the best and say that she thought I should do it. Had I not received that call, I wouldn't have entered the contest that season.
Wow. It's another great note. Again, people see you win and they think that possibly you're this powerhouse coming along all the way. And the questions that we have and the way we get into the contest. I just interviewed Jim Key, and his third year, he was talking about at a division level contest, one guy went overtime, and he says he really thought that guy would have won if he hadn't gone overtime. And
wow.
in that year in his district, he said it was a real tight race. And then the region was a real tight race. And then Jim winds up winning his third year. But all the way division, district, region, he said he could have been knocked out any time if certain things hadn't happened and if he hadn't prepared certain ways. And just like you going, if I hadn't gotten that phone call, I wouldn't have even competed.
Absolutely.
And, even with me, when I was in the finals, I got so down on myself on how badly I was doing. I almost felt like pulling myself out and calling the alternate and saying, you go, I don't think I'm worthy of being here.
Wow.
And then but that was my self-doubt I was up against. I had to push myself through that. And
Sure.
then once I got through it, but that was the self-doubt that hit me in everything I did in my life. And it was just like that contest made me go through that. And thank heavens I went through it. Otherwise I'd be driving a Lyft right now, talking on the cell phone, not interviewing David Henderson. Here's what I'm curious. Let's go back, because you take second at division, and that's close. What were your feelings when you sat there in the audience and they called your name as second? Were you like, oh, this is ridiculous. I should have won. These people are stupid. What were you going through at that point?
No, I was surprised. And I'm trying to remember exactly what the speech that the winner gave was about. That was the year that I realized that you have to tell a story to communicate with people effectively. And I remember thinking the speeches were all so different. I have to take you back, though, to square one. I told you I had a mentor in Toastmasters who very much pressed that, look, if you lose, it's because your speech wasn't good enough. I should add a bit more texture. His name was Mike Roth, and Mike was a veteran. He was Special Forces in Vietnam. So Mike was one of these tough as nails old guys. And he had just drilled that into me. Look, if you lose, it's because of something that you did or didn't do. And so my instinct was to stop and think, what did the person who won do that I didn't? You are heartbroken at first. I did think my speech was good because I'd worked really hard on it. But then my wife and I we had a cup of coffee, and she was the first to say it. Let's think through what they did that was better than what you did. And then we realized, you know what? You're not really telling a story. Your speech is focused on your friend, but it doesn't tell a compelling story that people want to listen to. And she was right.
Good. And the second year when you lost at district, you took second place at district.
I did.
Was there a growth opportunity in losing?
No, absolutely.
That year? What did you learn through that? What did you learn through losing that contest?
And I'll say this across the board, you learn the most when you lose. When you fail, when you fall on your face, when you do something that I had one speech that I disliked so much that I asked the person who posted it on YouTube to take it down. And I placed second at district in a tall tales contest with that speech. But looking back on it, it bothers me so much. I'm just like, I got to take this down off YouTube. I just can't stand looking at it. But to answer your question, that second year, what I learned was telling a story is not enough. You need to tell a personal story or a story that you can make unique to you. Because that year I told a story about a person I saw who did something amazing. He was driving past this house that was on fire. It just so happened that moments before he drove by that house, this woman's ex-husband threw a Molotov cocktail through her window. And the man's name was Jackie. Jackie stopped. He helped get the woman's daughter out of the house. And then Jackie went back, and Jackie actually pulled the woman out of the burning house, and he saved her life. It was such an amazing story. I thought, this guy deserves a speech. The problem was, as great as it wasn't my story, which is what I think it takes to do really well in the contest. So that was the main takeaway that year. There are lots of other small points too.
Yeah, I call that, again, having having gone through that myself and having coached probably in excess of 300 people, I go, this is called a book report.
Right. That's exactly what it was.
It's like in
Exactly what it
school.
was.
I'm going to tell you about the book, right? No, we want to hear from you. It's just a great. So you're within 2 weeks of not starting the contest in 2010. You get this phone call. You decide to throw your hat in the ring. What did you do to put your speech together? Did you have something in the can already that you were going to use? Did you have a specific inspiration you were working on?
I had an idea about what I wanted to write my speech about. I started thinking about the most amazing thing I'd ever seen someone do. And honestly, I started thinking about this as soon as I lost the contest the prior year. I'd literally been thinking about it since that time. And it's interesting because the process of answering that question took me on a path of self-discovery that I did not anticipate, which ended up being as important as the speech was itself. And I had written some preliminary drafts, but the draft that I wrote of that speech for the club contest was completely different than the draft I competed with at the district contest. And in between district and semifinals, that was the first time in my history of competing that I did not edit a speech in between those two stages. And I really haven't changed that speech much since. However, between the club contest and district, and this is from the time that I wrote the entire speech out word for word, I went through more than 20 drafts of that speech. I think I went through 24 or 25 drafts of that speech.
And going through that, what were you discovering as you went through the different drafts? What changed in the speech? How were you able to improve it?
It started off being very comedic. And I did several things to try to improve my speech writing skills. And this is a point I have to make. There was a point in my development as a speaker when my mentor walked up to me after speech and he said, the problem with you is not the speaking now. The problem is the writing. And my heart skipped because I was thinking, how do I improve my writing at this point in my life? What do I do? So I started reading. I started reading and reading and reading and reading. And I developed this fixation with Cormac McCarthy's novels. And Cormac McCarthy said in one of his interviews that death is the most important subject that we deal with in life. And if you're not writing about death, you're not a serious writer. Somehow I had that in the back of my mind. And the story that I decided to tell was a story of my mother forgiving her mother on her deathbed for abandoning her as a child. And so one of the biggest things I decided to do, and you got to remember, speech contests, you're supposed to give happy, positive, uplifting speeches. I decided that my grandmother was going to need to die during the speech. And it's easy to say now the speech was successful, but at the time, my wife and I were thinking, if she dies during the speech, how can this ever become a motivational speech? But ultimately it did. So,
well, yeah, and the thing is, you do want to leave. A lot of people I've seen will try to use death or disease or injury, as we call it, the DDI scale, which is the famous Ed Tate moniker, how many, death, disease, or injury issues. And as I say, it's not really about the death. It's not about the disease. It's not about the injury. It's how did we overcome that supposed insurmountable barrier in our life of losing somebody or having a disease that seemed greater than us or having injury that seemed greater than us. How did we as human beings overcome that? And that's where the uplifting part goes.
Absolutely.
Were you able to bring that speech around to have evidently, it won the contest. Were you able to bring it around to have a uplifting message at the end, or did you leave your audience crying in a puddle in the aisle when you left?
No, it has an uplifting message at the end. It does. And that contest season was the first time I realized that if you tell a story the right way, then the people that are listening to your story start thinking of their own stories. And they're focused on something they went through in their own lives. And if your speech is crafted the right way, you end up helping them move past whatever difficulty it is that they were dealing with. And it happened that year at the area level. I had a man come up to me afterwards, and he was tearful, and he said, that one really got to me. He said, I've dealt with something similar in my own life, and I just want you to know that your speech really spoke to me. And I'd never received a response like that one before, but that was the first time I actually realized what my gift as a speaker is, and it's the same as what my gift as an attorney and largely what my gift as a person is. And so I would say that it was a heartfelt speech, not an emotionally weighty speech so much as one that was the type of communication that seemed to touch people's heart.
Beautiful, beautiful. So you win district, and now you're going to Palm Springs to the semifinals. What was your preparation? What was your mindset at that point? You're the first year. We'll just make note. You're the first group of contestants that are now under the new system, which you don't have the regional and then the finals. You have the semifinal and the final at the conference. So you're the first crop of speakers coming through on that. You didn't get to experience the old one, so you can't really compare it. But what was your prep going into Palm Springs for the International Convention and your mindset as far as getting on the international stage? Were you going, I'm just going to give the best speech I can and what happens, happens? Or were you going, no, I'm intending to win this thing and get on? Just tell us what was going on with David Henderson during that 3 months between the district and the finals.
Well, my style is not conventional in the context of the speech contest. And it's easy to talk about it now that it was successful, but it was nerve-wracking because I found myself thinking, I'm so different from everybody else that I see competing, but you know what? I'm going to do this my way and see if it works. And so I'd given so much thought into speech construction that I knew if I construct my speech for the finals along the same basic method that I used for the speech that got to district, if my style works and people like it, then my final speech will be successful. So since I knew I liked my speech finishing up at district, I left it alone. And then I dedicated all my time to developing a speech for the finals. I'd already been giving some thought to what I wanted to write. It takes a long time to write a well-constructed speech. And so I dedicated a lot of time to writing my speech, and then I focused primarily on delivery. But the way the speech contest is constructed, I know that people have different thoughts about it. I think it's nerve-wracking having to compete in the contest one day, and then literally turn around the next day. Can't remember if it was the next day. I think maybe we had a day of rest.
2 days. It was Thursday and then Saturday. So
that's right. It was Thursday and Saturday. It's difficult because the entire time I was afraid that I was going to stand up on stage and give the opening for the wrong speech, because you have to rehearse them both simultaneously. And it's really hard to keep them straight in your mind. And it's hard to be emotionally centered in two speeches simultaneously. But that was primarily my preparation. I focused on developing the speech that I was hoping I would use at the finals. And I was working on that speech and revising it up until the day before I actually delivered it. And that wasn't because I hadn't prepared. That was because the audience is a living, breathing part of your speech. And once I saw what the stage was going to look like, once I got a better sense of what the crowd was like there at the finals, I had to make some adjustments for maximum impact with that speech.
Very good point, which several of the other speakers have said this too. There's a lot of speakers that show up at any contest I've seen, and they give a rehearsed, planned speech, regardless of who the audience is or what they were planning. The best speakers, the champions are. I talk about this. This is live communication to a group of people, and whatever's going on at that moment, you got to connect with them. You've got to touch them. You've got to move them. So you've got to adjust to the environment that you're in. With that, I'm glad to hear that. Did you go to a lot of clubs? Did you get a lot of feedback from people? What was your process on the second speech you won with?
I did not. And every time I talk about this, I feel like people don't understand where I'm coming from, because I only delivered that speech in front of an audience twice before I actually delivered it at the finals. And I feel like when I say that, people will say, oh, well, you know what? I don't like to practice a lot either. And I find myself thinking, I didn't say that. I didn't say I didn't practice a lot. But this is the way I would analogize it. If you take an actor who gets a new role, they don't have to learn how to act because they've already invested time perfecting the craft of acting. They just have to understand how to act in this specific role. When I was developing as a speaker, I identified the skills that I was already good at. I identified the ones that needed improvement, and I worked on those skills. I crafted those skills to the point where I think that what I knew how to do by the time I was writing that second speech was receive feedback and use that feedback to adjust my individual communication style. And so literally I needed to know, where are people going to laugh? What jokes are working well? Which ones are not? Which gestures need to be tuned down? Which ones need to be turned up? Because I already had an understanding of how those mechanics worked, I only needed to actually deliver the speech a couple of times to get it where I needed it to be. So I only actually delivered my speech twice before the finals, and I've only delivered it once since the finals, and I regret that I ever delivered it at all after the finals. I think I'm the only champ that doesn't go around repeating my final speech all the time. It's actually my semifinal speech is my favorite speech.
Yeah, I don't know that you're not the only one on that. I did for the first year just because people wanted it.
Yeah.
And after that, I went, it's a little bit like you win the 100-yard dash in the Olympics and you're all focused on this race and you're trained and you're, all your preparation. And then you go back to your high school reunion and they go, hey, you won the 100-yard dash. Joe, pace off 100 yards. Let's see Lance run. It's not the same environment when you're out and you're not in that competition. And
no, it's
so,
not. I overstated when I said the only. Go ahead.
I was going to say what I do now. I just show my video if people want to see it because that was the speech, and I haven't given that speech in 12 years, and
yeah.
I could probably do that. David, I want to comment just on this for our listeners on it because, every world champion has their own path to the world championship, and there are people like myself that. I went to 35 clubs and I worked that speech, but I was anyway, I'll talk about that in my interview. Darren LaCroix said, let nobody out prepare you. And what he did, Willie Jones said that he knew what he wanted to say and he didn't even work the words out. He just got up there and wanted to be in the present. But every world champion has their path. But here's the point I want to make to the listeners. It is their path. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily somebody else's path. It is their path that they knew was going to work for them, and they were fully owning the path. And for example, you had confidence, from what you're telling me, you had confidence in your ability to deliver the delivery aspect of the speech. You were trying to work on the message part. You had your confidence in your delivery
right
on that. So it was just you needed some verification on how's my message coming together for that, for that speech. And it worked. That path worked for you.
Right.
So you owned it. Now, in the interviews, I haven't heard of anybody that took the path that you did on your preparation, but it was your path and it worked for you. So that the point I want to make is when you're doing this, you have to figure out what you have to do to be the best you can be. And it's not necessarily somebody else's path.
Absolutely.
Somebody can do what I did, but that may not work for them. Somebody could do what Willie Jones did, but that may not work for them either. It worked for one of us in our own capacity on that.
I need to add something to that also. I want to add this because sometimes when people talk about contestants who've done well with their speaking, they only look at the speech contest and they exclude the rest of that individual's life in terms of what they're doing. Part of what I made sure to do was I actively practiced my contest skills in the courtroom and in other contexts where I could get up in front of people and talk. And so I was working on that skill set, and I like the point that you made in that I didn't focus so much on delivery, but I would say that I spent as much time rehearsing that speech as everyone else who's competed. I just did it in different ways that are not as traditional as what I think people are used to hearing in that response.
Good point. Good point. So let's go to the day of the event. What you're sitting there in the audience watching the speakers. What's going through your head?
I actually didn't watch any of the other speakers. Are you talking about at the finals?
At the finals, yeah.
By that time, I'd learned that I don't think it helps to watch the other contestants. At the finals, it's like the fanciest backstage ever. They had Starbucks coffee back there. They had all these pastries back there if you wanted to eat anything. It's an intimidating environment if you haven't been there before because you have some people back there who are already professional speakers. There was also a guy back there who had made it to the finals before who was an intimidating person, and I think he knew it. I think he enjoyed it a bit because I've talked to him since then. And so I had learned by this point I would find an area where I could sit down by myself. There were 2 seats toward the back of the backstage area. And so I sat in one, my wife sat in the other. I didn't have to worry about anybody coming up and sitting down next to me and just wanting to chat prior to the speech contest. And by this time, I'd also learned to have my iPod with me. I had my headphones in, and I was listening to music before I got up on stage. I was listening to music before I got up on stage. I think I was number 5 in the lineup. And then I watched the speeches after mine, but I didn't watch any of the speeches prior to the time I took the stage.
Okay, well, that's again, you're doing it your way, which is what exactly works for you. And there's a couple other people I know that was their approach, was to just be in my moment and not worry about what anybody else is saying. Just go up there and do what I can. After your speech, you're sitting there and they do, speaker number 3, speaker number 2. What was your mindset as the countdown's coming down? Did you feel you had a shot at it? Did you feel you had no idea what was going through your
I wasn't
your
sure.
mind there?
Yeah, I wasn't sure because I thought there was a very good chance that my style was unconventional enough to where the judges would just hate it. I didn't have a good sense of how much they liked it. And I would say that in between the speaker number 2 and them calling out the winner, whenever the jury comes back inside the courtroom and they have to read out the verdict, the judge asks the foreperson to stand, and then he'll say, "I see here, you, the jury, have found." It always seems like that fraction of a second lasts forever. Like it just seems like it goes on and on and on. And I remember when they called out my name, I think Jim Key asked me later what took me so long to get to the stage. I'm like, well, I didn't assume that they were going to call my name. And so I had to come all the way from backstage. I didn't know that people went out and sat in the front. I didn't know you could do that. So I was still backstage and I had to work my way all the way back up to the front because I wasn't assuming that they were going to call my name. So that was a nerve-wracking moment, one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. When they called it, it was one of the most exciting moments of my life.
Oh, congratulations. Congratulations. Well, one of let's just sort of talk about this for a second, because you brought it up that you'd had a hard time controlling your emotions in the courtroom, especially on closing arguments, especially in specific type cases. And one of the things that came out in your speech were your emotions.
Right.
And you were crying quite a bit in the speech and a few things. And then in your acceptance speech, you said that you had a hard time holding that back in a few things when it came through. Since winning this, did the competitions and giving that speech and going through that experience give you more control over that in your courtroom situations? And just address how did you accomplish what you wanted by your competitions to be better in your closing arguments? And I don't know, having a prosecutor cry in closing arguments could get a lot of guilty pleas.
And the funny thing was, when I looked back on my closing arguments, I actually never gave a bad closing argument. In fact, I received a lot of very positive feedback on my closing arguments. In fact, closing arguments is probably one thing that I can do better than the other trial skills. I just didn't feel good about how they were going. And to put this in perspective, after I won the World Championship, I actually started working with an acting coach that I'd met through Toastmasters. I started working with this acting coach specifically because I wanted to learn how to act like I didn't have any emotions. This is after I won the World Championship. I hired a coach and I asked
This is reverse. This is
Exactly.
reverse. You're about to act and get your emotions out. You're trying to act like you don't.
That's right. I said, teach me how to act like I don't have emotions. And then she was the person who forced me to realize that my emotions weren't a problem. They really weren't. And in court, when I delivered closing arguments, I was never as emotional as I was in the speeches that I gave through Toastmasters. But what I didn't understand was happening was this. An attorney's degree actually says attorney and counselor at law, but lawyers tend to forget about the and counselor part. And in order to do well in a court case, you have to be able to bring the story of the person who has suffered, which is at the core of every court case. Something bad happened to someone. You have to be able to make their story alive and vibrant for the jury. And in order to do that, you have to spend a lot of time with that person. So when I was developing my presentation skills, my public speaking skills, it just so happened I was in the SVU unit. So we had all the crimes against children, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. We had
And just for people, that's special victims, which is sexual, physical abuse. I mean, like you're talking about, just so people know what SV.
That's right. all the adult sex crimes, and then we had any violent crime that someone who was in a relationship with another person committed, or if they were related to the person that they committed, those all came to our unit. So I can think of 5 cases off the top of my head where a man just got mad and killed his wife or girlfriend. In those cases, typically the person who suffered has never told their full story to anyone. If you take a sexual assault case, for example, it may be relatively obvious what happened to the person, but there's always a name that they were called. There's something specific that someone made them do, and they typically have never told that to anyone. In addition to the fact that oftentimes what's happened to that person is so embarrassing, they just don't want to ever talk about it again. So you've got to get to know that person well enough for them to feel comfortable telling you the details of what happened so you can prove that case in court. By the time you spent enough time with them to do that, and it took me a while to realize that that's what it took, because you'd be surprised, a lot of prosecutors were losing these cases. And I realized the reason they're losing the cases is because they don't have the storytelling down pat. And spending the time with the person who suffered, by the time you get to delivering closing arguments, you know this person very, very well. You're no longer indifferent to what happened. And that is overwhelming emotionally by the time they have shared with you some of the things that they've been through, excuse me. I had one young lady, in fact, I just wrote an article about working with her on her case. She had been assaulted by her mom's boyfriend, and it happened every day for years. He assaulted her on the kitchen floor at night when everybody else went to sleep. She didn't talk about what happened before I started working with her. And so that case was almost dismissed. That guy was given 18 counts of life by the jury, but it came this close to being dismissed because she just wouldn't talk about what happened. And then when she finally did start talking about what happened, what was most difficult for her was that her mom and her 2 brothers were in the house every time she was assaulted, and they never tried to help her. But getting her to the point where she would talk about what happened and then share that with me, you can't be impartial when you're giving your closing argument, and that's what was difficult. So since the World Championship, and this took about 3 years after the World Championship, I developed an understanding of what was actually going on with respect to how I was communicating in court. And simply having that understanding made me significantly more impactful when I was giving closing arguments. It's also made me more impactful in terms of my interpersonal communication and getting someone to the point where they can share with me what I need to present the case well in court.
Well, you know, David, I get to talk to a lot of Toastmasters around the world. People have been in Toastmasters for years, world champions, and I promote that Toastmasters is a practice arena. It's like going to the gym for communication and leadership. You know, it's not the game. The game is outside of Toastmasters.
Right.
There are few, if any, people that I have spoken to that have utilized their Toastmaster skills in the way that you have to truly make a significant difference in society.
Thanks.
Both in what you're talking about, being able to on a one-on-one basis, get someone to open up who has had things happen to them that nobody in this, probably listening to this, hopefully nobody can imagine what's happened, and then get them to say that in court, explain that in court to a jury, and then prosecute that all the way through to a jury and bring justice and remove people from society that are truly harmful to those people around them. And I think it's a huge tribute to you, but it's also a huge tribute to the Toastmasters program and what you were able to get out of it, the way you utilized the program.
Absolutely.
And that's that in its own right is just is admirable and on what you've accomplished. And I'm sitting here going, holy smokes, look at, I've done a lot with my speaking, and I've talked to a lot of people what they've done, and we all have a desire to help, but you're right there in the trench on the street with sort of bleeding, hurting people right now that need those communication skills and taking it all the way through to a complete conclusion. I just want to, that's phenomenally impressive. And phenomenally.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So you just shared with us about a lot of what happened to you after the World Championship, but how did winning this change your life, your projection, your confidence, whatever? What was the change in you that occurred, if any, by becoming a world champion in public speaking? How's your life different today?
You know, it started the day after I got back from the contest. My boss at the DA's office was a really tough lady. Her name was Judge Susan Reed. She was the elected DA in San Antonio. And she was very savvy at keeping in track of what was going on in the media. So I had taken time off from work. I hadn't told my job about the speech contest. I don't know why. I didn't think it'd necessarily be a good idea to tell them about it because I may lose and I didn't want to have to answer a lot of questions about losing. So she saw some article that was in the news. I think MSN had published an article saying this year's speech contest winners from San Antonio, Texas. So I'm sitting there in Starbucks just unwinding the day after we get back. And I get this message and I can tell it's coming from the DA's office. So my heart starts skipping and I answer it and it's Judge Reed's assistant. And she says, Judge Reed wants to talk to you. Are you in the office? And I'm like, no, I'm not in the office, but I can be there in 45 minutes if I need to be. And I'm thinking, I don't know what I messed up or what happened, but I'm scared. And then she's like, well, let me tell the judge that you're not here and I'll call you right back. So then she calls me back. She says, no, she just wanted to say congratulations so you can come by tomorrow when you're in the office. And I'm like, oh, whew, okay, it's all good. And so I walk into Judge Reed's office and she's an accomplished woman. She's an accomplished person. And she is an intimidating person because she has a very strong presence. When I walk into her office, she stood up and she walked around from her desk and she shook my hand. She said, I just want to tell you congratulations because every lawyer wants to be the best speaker in the world. And that was the first moment that I actually thought about that, believe it or not. I'm telling you that I knew I needed to improve my trial skills. I knew I needed to be a better public speaker. But that was the first moment I stopped and I thought, you know what? She's right. Every lawyer does want to be the best speaker. And she put me in charge of a unit at the DA's office, which really put my storytelling skills to the test. Every DWI that resulted in a death came straight to my desk for the next 2 years. It was a very difficult position. To give you an idea of the type of pressure that was associated with that position, my predecessor actually committed suicide, and one of his predecessors had attempted it. And I went to work for the first 3 months, 2 or 3 months, with people reminding me of that on a day-to-day basis. And I assumed they'd be drinking buddy cases, like you and I are out drinking, we flip a coin, one of us doesn't make it home. One of the first cases I dealt with, an 18-wheeler was going the wrong way on the highway. The driver was twice the legal limit, got intoxicated. He hit an Excursion, a Ford Excursion. It had a 5-member family in it, ripped the Excursion in 3 different pieces. Only one of those family members survived. That was my very first case. I had a case where a young man who lived in my neighborhood was out walking with his parents. He lived in the neighborhood I grew up in. Out walking with his parents at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning, and a drunk driver swerved out of her lane, across the roadway, hit the father, swerved all the way back across the roadway, pinned him to a tree, and he passed away like that in front of his wife and his child. So these cases were really difficult, and Judge Reed assigned them to me in part because of what she saw in the speech contest. And I'm very thankful to her because that was a stressful job. And believe it or not, at the time, a lot of people were receiving probation for these offenses in San Antonio because they're difficult offenses because the person didn't mean to do anything wrong. It really stretched my communication skills. It stretched my storytelling skills. But the moment when I knew that I'd really improved beyond the contest was there was one case where this young man had been out on a Friday night. You have to think, he came from a working class family. So his parents sent him to school. He spent his Friday night volunteering to help kids with special needs. That's how he spent his Friday night. He's going back to his dormitory room on campus. He stopped at a stoplight. Drunk driver who was driving over 100 miles per hour on the access road rear-ended him so hard that he killed him. You know, you get like whiplash if you're in a car crash. The extreme version of whiplash is that your spine severs from your skull, and that's what happened to him. I was explaining to his parents how the process would work in terms of the case going to trial. And I told them, listen, I can never guarantee you what's going to happen in any court case, but this is a case where I don't think we should make any recommendation for a plea bargain. We should just try the case. And I can't tell when people are going to hug me. It's just one of those weird things. I can't always tell handshake or hug. I just get kind of thrown. What I remember about that meeting was I reached to shake his dad's hand, and then I turned to his mom, and I was going to reach to shake her hand. And before I could extend my hand, she just grabbed me and she hugged me, and she didn't let go of me for a while. And I look back on that moment and I realized that my communication skills were still growing like at a 90-degree angle after the contest. But that moment to me was a moment when I think I really started to realize how I needed to communicate with people one-on-one. That job and the success I had in that role, because we did manage to change the way the public saw those types of crimes in San Antonio in the 2-year period that I was fortunate enough to be part of that unit. I started being invited to do trial skills presentations for other prosecutors around the state. I spent a lot of time doing those, teaching lawyers how to tell stories, how to use PowerPoint for maximum effect in the courtroom, how to pick juries, which is basically interpersonal communication. At the time, I was also doing training for Toastmasters, and these also led to progressively better positions within the legal field. And so now I have developed a lot of expertise in terms of working with witnesses, storytelling in court. I told you before the interview started, I just joined the National Speakers Association. And one of the things that I've found I can also do is advise nonprofits about storytelling and advise businesses about storytelling. But I'm telling you, my growth curve has only leveled off. It's still steep, but it's only leveled off, I would say, in the past 2 to 3 years.
Well, that's fantastic, David. And I think you are such a phenomenal example of somebody taking the communication skills that Toastmasters teaches. And I've already said this, but you worked the system. You came in to improve your speaking skills, and you've taken that outside of Toastmasters and applied that in such a degree to make such a difference. And that, just from the standpoint of this interview and what this organization, what these programs can bring to people, you're just such a great example of that.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
We can go on and on, I'm sure, for another 2 hours and chat, and maybe at some point we'll have a chance to. But looking back, if you had just a couple tips or pieces of advice for young Toastmasters coming in, and you're a world champion now, who came in and 3 years later won the world championship, which is a remarkable feat in its own right. What tips or recommendations would you have for somebody?
The first advice I would give is to learn how to tell a story. Everyone says that. I don't think everyone understands the dynamics of telling a story. The best explanation I've heard was given by a man named David Lieber. He's a professional speaker, and he gives a diagram for storytelling that looks just like this. I'll draw it one more time. It's a straight line, then a V, then a curly Q. So you give your introduction, and then in the course of your introduction, the hero of the story, which may very well be yourself, has to take a dive. There has to be some serious problem that they're dealing with. But you can't leave the audience down here. If any speech is an example, the fact that you cannot do that, my speeches are that, because they have heavy content. You have to bring the audience back up. And normally this is kind of like a jagged rise, because the force of whatever the hero is dealing with is still pressing against them. And at the very end of the story, you wrap up all the loose ends and you're finished. The objective is to learn how to tell a story using that format. And I use that format whether I'm telling my wife what happened in the course of my day, whether I was delivering a speech in a speech contest, or whether or not I am presenting a case to a jury. It's always the same basic format. But what's critical is you have to give people some piece of advice that lets them know everything's going to be okay. That's really what people want to hear. To do that, to be an effective communicator, you have to be plugged in to what matters to society. It's something I didn't talk about in this interview, but my wife and I actually dedicated a lot of time to trying to figure out what is the ethos of people who are living in the world today, specifically in the United States. What is it that we care most about? Because you have to understand what that is to be able to communicate that to people. And the last piece of advice I would offer is you have to believe, and I think this starts with belief more than practice. You have to believe, and I'm just going to say it the way I feel it, that God has given you a unique ability to communicate with other people in a specific way that will make the world a better place. And if you can accept that belief And if you can accept that every time you failed or you mess up, you have now been presented with a chance to improve your ability to use your unique gift that God has blessed you with, then not only will you improve as a speaker, but your entire life will change for the better as a result of your involvement with Toastmasters, and you will make the world a better place.
That's very well said. Beautifully said. You know, over the years, like I said, we're talking about the fact that you were part of the first group that had the new system in Toastmasters of going to the conference for the semifinals and the finals in the same 3 or 4 day period.
Right.
Before that, it was the regional system. Toastmasters is currently looking at now putting in the sort of the video quarterfinals because of it's growing so much. Toastmasters International is trying to figure out how to administer all these things that they've created on it. As a world champion that's experienced the growth and, used these skills, how do you feel this world championship contest should be constructed? What element should be included in it to make it the most basically beneficial, productive contest for the organization?
My overall feeling with Toastmasters is that the old-fashioned way was better. I feel that way with most aspects of Toastmasters. I don't like the thought of Toastmasters moving toward a video format at all. I think that the speech contest should always be one where people are performing live on stage in front of an audience and being evaluated accordingly. And so that you know that I'm not simply talking out of school, when I present to other lawyers about how to use visual aids for maximum impact in the courtroom, I begin by telling them this needs to start with you and a microphone at most. In some courtrooms you have a microphone, some you don't. But the core speaking skills, you standing up in front of a live audience, that's what matters most in terms of becoming a more effective communicator. And I hate the thought of the speech contest moving away from that. Another aspect of the speech contest that often gets overlooked is the ability to craft a speech effectively and to understand how to develop that speech in the context of giving gestures and actual live performance. I think the speech contest, I regret that it even changed the way that it did for people who competed in my era, where you didn't give a speech at district, write a new speech for the regionals, write a new speech going to the finals. I thought that was a better format. I really did. I thought it stretched people to be better competitors. I wish we would stop making some of the changes we've made to Toastmasters. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of anybody who's coming up with these new formats. But going back to what you asked me about giving people a piece of advice, I forgot to mention this. Normally what I will tell people they need to do is pick a mentor in Toastmasters who is old enough to remember what the old requirements were for becoming a distinguished Toastmaster. That was true of my mom's friend, Miss Woody. And I found that people who are still familiar with that protocol tend to give the best advice in terms of mentorship. And then the other thing I would tell people to do, I know this is not related specifically to what you asked me, you need to find someone who wants to improve their communication skills as much as you do. Just so happened for me, that was my now wife. And have coffee with them as often as you can and talk through all the things you're doing wrong so you figure out how to do them right.
Good point. Having some sort of a person at the same stage that you are to work back and forth on things. So
right.
Very, very good advice. No, I appreciate your insight, and I think we're all respective of Toastmasters International and what they're struggling with a growing program. Right. And what those of us that have made it to the top have had the benefits of this. I just want to get everybody's input on and share that with Toastmaster, the people who get to watch this, on how we really feel you could maximize the benefit of having a contest like this, because it is a big part of the Toastmasters experience, and to me it's a big part of the Toastmasters growth are the competitions, not winning them but doing them. So,
right
on that. Well, that sounds fantastic. And to be honest, from a speaking standpoint, David, you got a phenomenal niche. As I teach I'm the dean of our academy with NSA, teaching speakers how to start their speaking business this year. And I say the riches are in the niches. And you can't be everything to everybody. You've got a really strong speaking niche and training niche there with the trial attorneys, and something that's critically important in society as well, to really seeing those come out. And having sat on some juries, I can I can testify that many attorneys are not very good speakers.
No, no, not at all. Not at all.
This has been an absolute pleasure, and I've got to learn some stuff about you I had no idea about, and I think you got a phenomenal story. I'm glad we were able to get it down and share it with Toastmasters. Thanks so much for being part of this summit, and I wish you the greatest success, and I look forward to catching up with you. If I get down in Dallas, I will definitely give you a call. And
please do. We'll go eat some barbecue.
That'd be fantastic.
All right.
Thanks so much, David.
Thanks, Lance. You have a good one. All right.